I'm going to attempt the impossible this morning. I'm going to try to get through this entire sermon this morning without once mentioning Dan Carter's groin. Oh, butter. It will shock you as much as me to learn that there are bigger disasters afoot than whether or not our All Blacks will survive the quarterfinals today without Dan. I know this because this week I saw some of the first signs of spring. Posters and billboards popping up in local parks and along roadways in a cacophony of reds and blues and greens. Someone who isn't into rugby must be a communist. Told me it happens every 3 years around here. It means a general election is coming up soon. Being from America, I said knowingly, "Oh, you mean in 2 years?" "No," he said, "in a little more than 6 weeks." Aghast. I said, "But the World Cup isn't over for 2 weeks." If they win, there's at least 1 week more of celebration, and if they lose, there's a mandatory 4-year period of mourning and recriminations. There isn't time to have an election. My knowledgeable friend nodded wisely. Convenient, eh? I think he was a Canadian communist. He then pointed out the obvious to me, since Americans can be a little thick. Holding an election no one notices is the best kind for those in power. But I get it now. It is important that we find the time to notice, not just because it's a requirement of good citizenship. Today's parable points out why. It calls us to come to the party. The kingdom of heaven is at stake. On the face of it, Matthew tells us a terrible parable. It is his version of Luke's parable of the wedding feast. Everyone is too busy to attend, but with what feels like a large dollop of gratuitous violence. Unlike Luke, Matthew has the king's minions killed by the intended guests. The king promptly responds in kind and has his soldiers kill them and burn their cities. Just in case we aren't repelled enough, he then binds and throws out one of his guests who is not properly dressed. Jesus begins by saying, we should compare this to the kingdom of heaven. He closes with the mysterious line, "For many are called, but few are chosen." This parable gives biblical scholars more fits than All Black fans are having over Dan Carter's, you-know-what. There are all kinds of efforts to reconcile the story, a story of violence, with the storyteller, a storyteller of peace, who is better known for telling us to love our enemies and not kill them. Most of their efforts I found convoluted and amusing, but there was one suggestion that made some sense. When Matthew told the story, it was after Rome had destroyed the temple and much of Jerusalem during the Jewish wars. For Jews, this was an event as traumatic as the destruction of the Twin Towers on 9/11 was for us. It changed the world as they knew it. It left them in shock. The suggestion is that Luke's version was an earlier version that Matthew reinterpreted in light of that event. This interpretation suggests Matthew was challenging the idea that we need to accept and adjust to the present reality. When Jesus said, Compare this story about a king giving a wedding party for his son with the kingdom of heaven. It was for us to contrast the way this world is against a world where love, hope, compassion, and forgiveness reign. The king and his son are not an allegory for God and Jesus, as is often suggested. If they are an allegory at all, they are an allegory for the empire. If Jesus is in the story at all, he is the one cast out of the party. He is the one who stands in opposition to the present reality, where the powers that be do unspeakable things. To stand up for justice, peace, and compassion for those on the margins is not going to endear anyone with the power brokers. Few are willing to pay the price of such rejection by speaking in opposition, although we are all called to do so. I saw the movie The Help this week. Loved the book, so I needed to see it. It tells the stories of black maids in Jackson, Mississippi, who raised white people's children and took care of their homes. There is one particularly painful scene. The mother of the storyteller confesses in shame to her daughter that she had fired their maid of over 20 years. The reason? The maid's daughter used the front door instead of the back door when there were guests from a racist women's group having lunch there in the mother's honor. Rather than be judged by their bigotry, she cast out both the mother and daughter, who were like members of the family, into the outer darkness. Compare this to the kingdom of heaven. In addition to this movie, Matthew's parable, and Dan Carter's Groin, I've also been confronted by Naomi Klein's book, The Shock Doctrine, The Rise of Disaster Capitalism. It is a very painful book to read that tells how Milton Friedman, a professor at the Chicago School of Economics, and his countless students over 4 decades have brought to us a world where unfettered capitalism is considered moral and in our best interest, where it is considered acceptable that a very small percentage holds most of the wealth while the numbers in poverty continue to increase. Compare this to the kingdom of heaven. Friedman's vision of a perfect world was one not hampered by government taxes and regulations, unions, state-owned assets, consumer protection laws, tariffs protecting local industries, social spending, public education, protection of natural resources, superannuation, government health care, or a minimum wage. The Chicago School of Economics has one article of faith. It is that the state's sole function is to protect our freedom both from the enemies outside our gates and from our fellow citizens. In other words, to supply soldiers to kill our enemies and police to cast out those in our midst who do not conform. Compare this to the kingdom of heaven.